set the recorder. And so let's begin. So again, I'm Randy Kearns. I'm your professor over here at the University of New Orleans. And this is session 6 of our 8 core competencies for healthcare managers. And today we want to talk about communication. Our key components when we want to talk about communication are highlighted by our 5 things from today. That includes, again, kind of the general definition of what is communication. We also want to talk about nonverbal communication, a little bit about the communication process, and then credibility. What are things that are essential in your communication being considered important or essential? And then 3 qualities of effective communication. So again, those are our 5 things for today. And again, we're on core competency 6 of our 8 core competencies. So we start with the key elements of communication. You know, we live in a world today where there's a lot of information available on the internet, some of which is not true or doesn't represent all of the facts. And so the source of the content is always important. Is it a trusted source? Is it a reliable source? Those are key questions in terms of what we're trying to understand where our information is coming from. The goal, what are we trying to communicate with somebody else? And that somebody else is the audience. When we talk about the audience, who's out there and who are we trying to send a message to? Context is also important. When we talk about context, we're talking about how does what we're trying to say fit in the overall message. You know, there are words or phrases at times that can be taken out of context and can lead to confusion. And so it certainly is important to remember the context of how things are being said. The message is exactly what is being said. What are the words being used? What's the source that the information is coming from? And then how does the information get there? And then the media is also a part of the how does the information get there. What form of media are you using to pass on the information? Are you writing words? Are you having a discussion? Are you using video conferencing, such as what we're doing? The media component is important, particularly when you're trying to look for additional validation of what's being said or what's being discussed. And so when we talk about media, it is important to consider how the technology that we're using or the form of media that we're using, are we leveraging it in a way to help us as best we can get our message across? And then the last one is feedback. Feedback is really important because feedback, again, gives us some validation to what we're saying, or feedback also lets us know that the audience at least is engaged with what we're talking about. You know, I've said several times, and I'll say again, I would much rather be in your classroom. The feedback that I get from that is it allows me to stop along the way and ask questions along the way. It also allows me to stand in front of you and see each of you at the same time, and I can get body language from that. The feedback that allows me is to help me understand how much you understand, or do I need to stop and go back and explain something, or do I need to go into more detail about a given situation? Because the media that we're using to deliver this lecture, this presentation, is more of a video conference type approach, we lose some of the feedback that we normally get in a face-to-face environment. Now, I say that sometimes we don't have a face-to-face environment as an option. That certainly was the case during the pandemic, and so we're kind of stuck doing what we're doing. But it is important from a feedback standpoint that the more feedback we have, the better we are at being able to communicate the information that we're trying to pass on or convey. So in perspective, it's important to get at what are you saying? What does it mean? How does it translate? How do you understand it? What are you doing? You know, what are things that you're trying to get accomplished, and what does this communication tell us about things that you're trying to get accomplished? And then what needs to be done? What is still pending to be done? What do we need to be working on? What's our next steps from where we are? But again, critical pieces of the perspective of communication. What needs to be communicated includes words, instructions, what are key pieces of information that needs to be shared. But communication in perspective is all about trying to be sure that we help people understand what we're saying and the instructions we're trying to provide. And then how does it need to be communicated? Sometimes it needs to be written so that people have written follow-up. Sometimes I finish a face-to-face meeting and go back and write an email that says, this is what I understood from our phone call or our meeting, and a purpose to that is to reinforce what we've just talked about. It's also to clarify points and to avoid confusion. There are times that you walk away from a meeting with the perspective that, you know, I thought one thing, somebody else thought another. And so it is important to think in the context of what does this mean and how does it apply in a given situation. A part of this expectation is going forward. Are there follow-up questions? You know, we have a fairly firm structure in how we deliver this content where I go over the content for about an hour and then we spend some time with follow-up questions. Again, that works okay when we're using video conferencing to deliver a topic, but it's not great. The follow-up questions are much better when the structure allows more of a free flow. It allows you to, during the middle of the conversation or during the presentation, to say, can you help me understand this piece a little bit better? That way, there's more understanding as you cover each topic before you move on to the next topic. And a part of that communication is the follow-up questions and the ability to respond immediately. Again, sometimes it's just not an option to be physically present at the same location where the information is being presented. And that's certainly our case today. But it is important to know that so when you don't have that in place, you have to have more structure. When you have more structure, it becomes less engaging and it becomes more mundane. Again, not the most ideal way to, in this particular case, teach a class, but sometimes it's the best available alternative. And that is important to remember in terms of any communication that you have. You're typically better off being face-to-face with someone in their presence or they're in your presence when you're communicating. when you're not face to face, you start to lose different parts of the communication, and it's not ideal. While it may not be ideal, it sometimes is the best available alternative, and that's, as I say, kind of where we are right now. And then where does the story go from here? You know, a part of this is to remember that there are demands associated with any communication. It includes attention from you. It includes a focus from me. There's a certain dialogue that has to exist where there are things that it's not just what I'm saying, it's what are you understanding, it's what you hear. And that's a part of the dialogue. And particularly when we're moving from English to Mandarin Chinese, there can be some lost context. And so it's important for me to enunciate and to be sure that the words that I'm using are clear and help you better understand the information. Because while each of you have a certain degree of English skills, I have no skills to speak Mandarin Chinese. And so it's important in terms of being sure that I convey a clear and concise message, that we're able to share information in a way that gives me feedback as well as giving you the information that you need. You know, it's also important to remember that data alone is really information without context. In other words, if I gave you the numbers 714 and 70118 and 504, those numbers in and of themselves wouldn't mean anything to you. But if I told you from an information standpoint that 504 is the area code of phone calls, of phone numbers here in the New Orleans area, or 70118 is a zip code of something that we use to mail, then I've suddenly turned numbers into information. And so early on in particularly scientific query, or where we're using a lot of spreadsheets, we wind up with a lot of data without context at times. And that's okay if we're trying to just look at the numbers and try and understand what the numbers mean. But as we begin to understand what the numbers mean and we put them in the context, that's when it changes from data to information. And then the most important part of this is how do we communicate that information? How do we share that information? Sometimes it's really just a matter of we share the numbers with some basic interpretation, but sometimes it's more than that. And so it's really about how do we share that information. So in Western civilization, certainly here in the United States, we because most of us came from other backgrounds, we draw on a lot of different historical societies. You know, the history of China, as an example, is really rich. It's far-reaching, and it has a number of philosophies. Sun Tzu, as an example, there are quotes and information. Sun Tzu, there's a book called The Art of War, and it relies on some of the strategies of Sun Tzu. And again, just helping us understand the one advantage we have here in America is we don't we don't really have 2,000 years of history or 3,000 years of history. And so we look to those civilizations who do to give us insight into how things have developed through the centuries. One particular example is Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher during the rise and later fall of what was originally the Greek Empire, and then became more of the Roman Empire, and then the Byzantine Empire. But Aristotle wrote that the argument has three distinct but inseparable dimensions. And his point was, if we understand the dimensions of each discussion or each argument or each critical thought, then it's a lot easier to be sure to make our point. The first is logos, or command of language, reason. People who have a wider vocabulary, who are more likely to use more words to discuss a position, or to discuss a value and how something is done, are actually far more likely to be able to make a point, and for that matter, to win an argument, if that's a debate. But logos is command of language. Pathos is commanding the audience or your own emotion. And the part of that is a part of, a part of managing your emotion is to be sure that your audience sees your passion for something that you're doing, without being over the top. It's a balance, and so pathos is really about taking command of the classroom, or taking command of an audience or a larger group setting. And the whole part to pathos is to help us understand how we command the emotion of our audience. And then ethos or ethos, who you are as a person. Do you have credibility? Do people look to you for answers or solutions? I look to Professor Wu there in your classroom as someone who has great credibility because of what she knows, because of her position there in the classroom, and to a greater extent there at the university. But having that credibility makes it much easier for you to be able to deliver a message or deliver content in a way that people hear, understand, respect, and can potentially answer or use that information in a positive way. But logos, pathos, and ethos are all key components of what's considered the dimensions of argument or persuasion. So listening. A part of being able to communicate includes being able to listen. There's a real challenge with listening, though. And part of the challenge comes back to, are you listening to hear the story being told? Or are you listening so that you can think through your own experiences and potentially offer a better story? Sometimes we see that in people who are highly competitive, and it can be considered disrespectful. So be sure you're listening to the story to listen to the story. It's not a competition. And this really starts with empathy. Be sure that when you're listening, that what you hear allows you to see the perspective from the person telling you this, not just getting ready to offer some type of response or follow-up. Areas of disagreement. If there are areas of disagreement, look for ways to bring them out into the open, and so that you can objectively and positively discuss them. Paraphrase is about hearing something in a grander context and then offering maybe a more concise way to say the same thing, or at least deliver the same intention. One of the things that I try to remind students about writing is if you're using the words of someone else, then cite what they said, but I don't need the entire quote. In fact, I would rather read in your words how you understand what they said. And that's really the art of paraphrasing. And then ask the right questions. What are questions that we're trying to help resolve? What are things that you're unsure about? A part of listening and a part of a good follow-up question is showing that you've listened to some of the key concepts or context of what they're trying to offer and what they're saying. And then actively listening. We show active listening by eye contact, facial expressions, body language, other things that show that we're actively listening to what's being done. And then immediate feedback. How much immediate feedback do you offer? How quickly can you respond to what's being said? How much confirmation can you offer for that? Typically, if someone asks you a good question, first of all, it's important to remember that all questions are good. The question was valuable to the person asking the question, and so the information that you give them is also important to show your respect for their willingness to listen and willingness to ask you a question. And so all questions are good. Some may be a little bit better than others, but there's no such thing as a bad question. And so questions help form dialogues. Questions help people understand context or topics. And so just remember that all questions are good questions. Just be sure you have good intent in the question. And then authority. So it starts with how much do you know? What do you know? How much do you know? How well do you perform within the confines of what you're trying to present? Do others learn from you? What can they learn from you? What type of information do you offer? Sometimes it starts with information that breaks new ground, meaning it's new, breaking news, it's cutting edge, it's kind of the next great idea. And sometimes your new ideas are bolstered by your past accomplishments. What have you done in the past? I write papers at times, and I publish papers at times, and a lot of what people look to and expect from things I will publish in the future is in part based on what I've published in the past. And so again, it's past accomplishments. And then raw intelligence. What type of specific intelligence do you have in terms of numbers or data or information? But the raw intelligence mixed with things that you also know creates a more solid set of facts, so that going forward, it's easier to present a complete picture and a full understanding of what's going on. Understanding human nature. It's human nature to be curious. It's human nature to question. And all of those things are good. And so, as we recognize the human nature that's in all of us, to be inquisitive, to want to know more, to have more experiences, the understanding of human nature is a key part of that. And then what type of judgments have you had in previous situations? This write your judgments is really about helping us understand what type of judgments we've made in the past that have both been positive and those that have not been positive. And then how does that help inform decisions that we make for our future? And then last but not least, how do you come across? Do you come across as an authority of the content, or are you uncertain about what you're trying to teach or present? One of the first things you can do is develop confidence in yourself and confidence in what you're trying to do. Other qualities of effective communication include accuracy, being sure that the things that we say are accurate. We've checked for the fact validation, be sure that what we're saying is accurate. Are we clear in what we're saying? What type of clarity do we have? Does that include clarity of thinking and clarity of expression? But clarity is about being sure that we cleanly and effectively talk about key topics in a way that people understand them. And then the brevity is recognizing how much span of attention people have. Again, ideally, if I were in your classroom, I would pause every few minutes to ask questions during the classroom, because from a brevity standpoint, once you make a point or two, it's important to stop and listen to what other people have to say. Because of the nature of how we're presenting this information, it's difficult for us to do that. It really chops up the delivery at that point. But just understand that brevity is an important aspect of effective communication, and brevity certainly delivers a much better, more thoughtful delivery of information. Again, someone in your classroom could easily stop after several key topics and ask questions and the point to those probing questions are really about being sure, some type of confirmation that you do understand what we're talking about, and that you're excited and engaged. And if you're not, what are things that we can do as instructors to help you get excited and engaged as it deals with this particular topic? And then that gets back to the vigor. How much passion do we have for what we're trying to say, what we're trying to teach, the way we share the information? The vigor part of this is about connecting with the student and connecting in the classroom, and covering the content that needs to be covered. And then as we analyze our audience, we start the question with who is the audience? Who are we talking to? Who are we sharing information with? What's my relationship to the audience? And how are they connected to me? And then what are their attitudes likely to be as they relate to my proposal? When we talk about attitudes toward my proposal, again, it's understanding what your audience wants. It's understanding what your audience needs. And a part of this is how much do they already know? What type of information has already been shared with them? As we teach these topics from over here at the University of New Orleans to your classrooms there at Putian University, in many cases, such as this, you've already had some of this information from your professor. And so these classes are used to reinforce some of the things that have already been said, and generally give you some of this information in English so that as you develop your bilingual skills between both Mandarin Chinese and English, you hear some of the same information from a purely American perspective using English words. And then, is my proposal in your interest? All proposals have satisfy at least two needs. And that's typically my needs and your needs. If I'm proposing something that doesn't at least partially satisfy your needs, it's very difficult for me to convince you to agree to it or accept it. And so being sure that our interests are aligned makes it much easier for me to make a proposal that you're more likely to accept. Again, the audience analysis is really about finding out who you're talking to, why you're talking to them, what do they want to hear. There was someone that I worked with many years ago who was, let's just say, he was a really difficult human being to work with at times. And he was honest, brutally honest. And he would, early into some of my meetings with him, he would say, let me just stop you for the moment. And let me just say, one thing that I'm listening for and what you're having to say is what's in it for me. He said, I know that sounds kind of selfish. He said, but the reality is that's what everyone listens for at some point, is what's in this for me. He said, so if you could just go ahead and get to that point, it may make it easier for me to understand some of the other things that you want to do. Now, again, he was, by his very nature, he was a difficult person. He still is a difficult person. He was hard to get along with, and he was hard to get to know, and sometimes he was hard to like. But he was also very honest, and he told me if I want to connect with him and I want his support or his endorsement for something I want to do, I need to start out with what's in this for him. And that was one of the most important life lessons that I learned working for people like that. Now, the reality is most proposals you make, that's probably at least a part of what the audience is listening for. What's in this for me? Why do I need to listen to this? Is this important? And so I would tell you, in terms of audience analysis, it's always important to think in the context of what are you trying to tell your audience that's in their best interest, and then how do you best say that? So 3 more pieces. Motivate your audience. What type of rational persuasion do you have? If they're hostile, is the audience positive? Is it neutral, or is it hostile? If it's hostile, how can you diffuse some of that hostility? If it's neutral, how do you rationally persuade them? Because the aim is to get to a point of where it's a positive reaction and you're trying to motivate them. Having managed large groups of people before, again, it depends on their perspective. If things have gone very poorly for an extended period of time, it may be a hostile audience, and it's going to be difficult to get their attention and to redirect them and to get them more in a positive light so that they hear and understand what you're trying to say and respect what you're trying to do. How much do they already know? When we talk about how much do they already know, we start out with, again, what type of information do they already have? How familiar are they with the foundation of either my argument or my proposal? What else do they need to know? How much more information do I need to share with them? And how can I write or speak in a language that they understand or respond to? And language isn't just about, I speak English, and I speak small amounts of Spanish. And I have people working at my house yesterday and today and tomorrow and last week and the week before, but they primarily speak Spanish. And so having a common language that we can both talk about things, I can talk with them in Spanish. I can at least understand much of what they're saying in Spanish. But because I don't use Spanish very often, it becomes difficult for me to ask key questions without having to change back to English. But whether we're talking about types of languages like English and Spanish or English and Mandarin Chinese, and as I've said before, while the world is full of more than 5,000 languages, more than 55% of all of the people who live on the planet today speak one of three languages: English, Mandarin Chinese, or Spanish. And so knowing two languages, knowing more than two languages is quite beneficial. I will tell you that I've struggled trying to learn any phrase in Mandarin Chinese. The Asian languages have a different basis of development than most of the Latin based languages. And so I'm sure it's very difficult for you to learn English because just from my perspective, it's also difficult to learn Chinese. Mandarin Chinese, I've not been around most people who speak Cantonese. But another part of this is there are other elements of language that this also means aside from the definition of language as we know it. And what I mean by that is in healthcare, as an example, we have a substantial group of words and terms and acronyms that we use that in many cases almost sound like its own language just simply because the words are highly technical. They're related to anatomical structures. And again, sometimes it's very difficult for us to take that information and turn it into trying to understand what we're trying to do here. Okay, so sell the benefits, not the features. What that really means is a part of rational persuasion is to talk about, again, what's in it for them, helping them understand what the value is for them to work with you or to convince them to take a certain action, makes it important to the more underlying aspects of the conversation. Not features means don't highlight key pieces just because they're flashy or they're shiny. The aim here is to sell the benefits and not the features. What's in it for them? How does this help them to get better, to be better? You know, and then communicating with external audiences. Whether it's free press, what are we looking for in ways that we can share information? So the advantage to social media is there's a lot of ways that we can share information that's free. But there's also complications associated with that. So again, social media has its advantages, but it also has some significant disadvantages. But it's always good to have free press. What's the publicity that's out there? What are things we can do that that help us get to the point of what we're trying to, whatever information we're trying to share. And then audience. In terms of what audience are we looking for? How do we share the information? What type of timelines are available? Timelines help us establish a point of when something starts, what's going on during the middle of it, and then how it ends. Timelines help people understand the why behind things that have been done by looking at the what was done in a timeline way, you know, in a way that things unfolded. What are the key facts to a given situation? There are key elements that everyone needs to know, and there are key facts that everyone needs to have that's a part of all of this. and a part of that includes the reliability, looking for ways to be sure that we're telling the truth with and we're using the facts that are available. We're using the information that's available to support what we're saying. And then another part of this is understanding keywords, or also known as jargon, but understanding press words that may be used by people who work in media, print media, or video media, such as working in television or working for a newspaper. But press jargon helps you understand what's being asked and how it's being asked. Press releases, that's information that you put out that may be picked up by another person or other groups of people. Attention-grabbing information or headlines help convince people to pick up the story and write more about the story. A press release will help people recognize that an official message from an official organization is out there, and what's the value of it being out there. Role of the press in a crisis management. You know, the press can be your friend. They can also be very challenging. It's essential that we not get distracted by what we're doing in crisis operations, but it's also important that we share the facts that we know during a crisis so that people are fully informed. Don't overlook what's obvious. And then there's something called NIMBY, which means not in my backyard. And what that really means is the closer we are to my backyard, what's behind my house, the more interested I'm in. And the more interested I am in a crisis, the more I really don't want to know this is going on right in my own backyard, meaning it's close by. You know, if there's a train wreck, or if there's something horrible that's taking place, you know, part of this is being sure that I know where it's at. The not in my backyard part means I really don't want this to happen close to my home. But if you tell me more about it, I can at least know how to, what are things I can do in the future to maybe try and prevent this from happening again. But crisis management, there's a lot of roles that the press plays in crisis management. And so it's very important for you to have an open and honest dialogue with the press during a crisis type event. You know, for communication and teamwork, one of the important things to remember about this is one of the cornerstone things that we do in healthcare, is we have to have good communication skills. When we don't have good communication skills, we can wind up with medical errors, medical mistakes, and that can lead to a very poor experience with the patient and the patient's family. And that also includes how many times a regular hospital stay, we wind up with communication, either issues or opportunities. On average, there are about 50 people involved with a patient during a regular 3 to 4 day stay. And so having good, solid, consistent, factual communication between two people each time that opportunity arises is essential in continuation of care. It's essential in avoiding medical mistakes and medical errors. And again, just recognizing that if there are approximately 50 people involved with each patient encounter at a hospital, there's lots of opportunities for information to get confused, or to get it misplaced, or to not be complete. And so we have to make an extra effort to try and be sure that we make that connection. And so the last piece is also work in teams in terms of meeting expectations or exceeding expectations, providing high quality care, and doing things in a way that, again, is beneficial to the patient. And if we keep in mind that this is good for the patient, we also need to understand it's good for us as an organization. Another part of this is the art of expression. How do we send information? How is the information received? And then how is it understood? A part of this is based on the communication process. And when we talk about the communication process, we have both the sender, the person who has the idea. We have the idea, the piece of information that needs to be shared. Typically think about the key facts. What are the key facts? And the message. What is the message being sent, and how are you sending it? What are other things being used? What are symbols being used? Is there body language involved? Facial expressions? What are all of the different pieces that go into the communication process? It's far more than just the words that I use. And it's far more than the tone that I use, although I certainly wouldn't want to deliver it in a monotone type way. It's important for me to think about the words I choose, the facial expressions, the eye contact. As an example, I'm not in your classroom, so it's very difficult for me to kind of move around the classroom and scan the room and make eye contact with each of you in the room. Instead, I'm sitting in front of 4 computer monitors. I have a monitor here that's got the voice to text closed captioning that's being done. I've got another monitor here and another monitor here that have random pieces of information on it that really have nothing to do with our class today, but things I'm working on later today. And then I have the working presentation here. And the problem with all of that is the camera is here. And so for me to be sure that I'm giving you the impression that I'm making eye contact with you, I've got to be sure that I'm looking at the camera. Well, it's hard for me to look at the camera and then also look at the slides and then look at the voice to text closed captioning to be sure that I haven't missed key topics or keywords that I needed to use in the presentation. So the communication process is really about trying to balance out all of those pieces, particularly when we're distant like we are. Again, hopefully this is the last time we're distant like this, but we just have to make the best of the situation, and that's what we're doing. So a little bit more about the communication process is also, with this, we talked about the sender. What's the point of the sender? What type of idea do they have? What's the message being sent? We also need to remember the receiver. Who is receiving the information? How are we sending that information? And what's being sent? And in addition to the receiver, your interpretation. What do you get out of this? What are you hearing from this? What's inferred? What type of perceptions are there? And the response. How do you respond to the information that's been presented? How does this contribute to what I know or what I need to know? When we think about the sender and the receiver, there are also barriers to that. One key barrier that we have right now is language. My language skills and your language skills, but there are other barriers. One critical barrier that we've worked through and continue to deal with is the quality of sound. I'm having a lot of difficulty hearing and understanding some of the things that you're saying, not because of how you're saying it, but because of the sound quality that I'm hearing through the system that we're using. And it is a barrier to communication, and it can lead to frustration If you're having to repeat the same thing, it can be frustrating, and I'm sorry. That's a barrier to communication that we have right now. Again, if I was there, it would most likely not exist. It would most likely be a situation that we could easily overcome, and we're overcoming it, but um, it's not ideal, just simply because when we're using technology, it's important for all of the technology to work to the best of its ability. I just presume, we just sometimes don't have a good sound quality that exists through some of these systems. Um, Again, all of this tells us that communication is more than just words. It's more than the things that we're saying. It's really about the presence that we have in front of the people that we're presenting the information or that we're sharing the information. And then there's information that's intentional and information that's unintentional as far as communication goes. Being sure that we're authentic, being sure that we're truthful. There's also that fake news, fake communication that's out there. Technology allows us to make up things in a way that's really convincing, in a scary sort of way. I don't know whether it's going to take us as a society, but it leads to a lack of trust, and it can be very difficult when we don't trust one another to be able to communicate or talk with one another. How do we focus on authentic communication is really important in terms of how we get things done. Another part of this is the channel. What type of channel are we using to send the information? Is it a face-to-face delivery? Again, I prefer a face-to-face class. And in a face-to-face class, it's a lot easier for me to constantly look around the room and make eye contact with the people in the room, and to be sure that you hear what I'm saying, and to be sure that I'm giving you information that makes sense to you. Mobile communication, text message, it's very easy for us to lose some meaning in a text message. Electronic communication is certainly an important aspect. Written communication is one of the most common things that we do with email and with text messaging. And then other types of communication can be media broadcast. And then how do we change this from low channel to high channel richness? What I mean by that is context. The more context we have of a given story, the more details we have, the better it is for us to understand it. And video conferences give us a better communication than a text message or an email. But again, this reminds us that nothing is better than a face-to-face communication. Sometimes that's not available, and that's kind of where we're at today, where that's not available. But when that becomes available, that's the best way to deliver a message. The way we text each other has really changed the face of communication. So much so that sometimes we're sitting next to each other, sending each other text messages. That can be problematic. If we're facing each other, if we're talking to each other, chances are far more likely we're going to hear and understand what was said, and have a better meaningful conversation than if we're just sending text messages to each other. Emoticons have emojis have also arisen and helped us share information or adding context. Sometimes the words we use can be dry or dull. Using emojis or emoticons can also remind who I'm sending the message to what I'm thinking at the time I'm sending this message. We constantly need to assume that the other person is using words in the same way and they thinking the same way that we are. Just understand that's not always the case. And so the more we try to communicate with one another, the more sometimes these experiences can only be available, and without that experience, it cannot be fully communicated. And to some extent, it can prevent them from being shared or understood. Again, this gets back to being present. How much do you know? How are you sharing the information? Being sure that you're paying attention to what's being said and the people saying it. How does the information come across, and what does the information mean both to them and to you? And then listening for content. Being sure that we're not listening to offer a rebuttal, or we're not listening to try to offer a better story, but we're listening for the sake of listening. And asking maybe a probing question or a follow-up question shows that you're an active listener, not that you're a debater, but an active listener. If you debate, you're listening for an argument that you can make as soon as they complete their sentence. But if you're an active listener, you're looking for completion of their story and maybe a follow-up question to reinforce that you heard what they were saying. It's hard not to interrupt at times, but avoid the urge to speak. Try to be sure that you don't step on the words of others, that you let them complete their thoughts. And it's also important, particularly when someone has a different point of view. We all come from different aspects of the world, and when we do, that sometimes influences our point of view or our opinion. But each opinion is important in this world, and the more we're open to it and the more we can listen, we can at least then understand why people think the way they do about certain situations. There will be times that you disagree, but don't be openly defensive about what's being said or what's being done. That hostility, the more hostile you are, the more it closes off or ends communication. Being honest, being direct in your feedback to the speaker can be very helpful in how we complete thoughts and how we share information. Again, the whole point to this is clear communication and keeping kind of the goal of what you're trying to do in mind as you're having that conversation. Avoiding the blame game, being sure that we don't wind up blaming one another or looking for ways to debate one another or negate what somebody else has said. Again, we want to be supportive, and if we're not sure about something, ask probing or follow-up questions. It is important to remember how teams participate and how much enthusiasm is there. Sometimes it's difficult to convey that enthusiasm. It's always important to show enthusiasm. And so if you have a member of the team or members of the team who are not enthusiastic about what's being said or what's being done, how can you help them come along to a better part of what's being done or what's being said? It is important to be sure that we're not blaming somebody for a lack of performance. The more we create this circle of blame, the more it becomes difficult for us to accomplish what we're being asked to do. People will take responsibility if they're responsible adults, and it's not about blame; it's about finding solutions. And so, the sooner we can put the blame behind us, and the quicker we can pivot to looking for solutions, the better off we're going to be. Because it gets down to what are we trying to achieve, what are we trying to accomplish, and that's a part of those team goals, those team understandings. From communication standpoint, we've got to make every effort to meet and communicate with members who are participating, but more importantly, those who are not participating. We've got to be sure that people who are not participating understand what's trying to be achieved by the team. What are you trying to do? What's going on? When are people working together? And then working toward that mutual understanding. You know, here are some examples of body language. What are you saying when you say nothing at all? Are you being defensive? Are you being arrogant, annoyed, irritated, happy, or confused? You know, nonverbal communication, when we talk about nonverbal communication, a lot of that gets back into body language, your facial expression. Sometimes it's your body movement or your posture. It can be gestures. What type of hand gestures do you have? Eye contact. And to some extent, there are some societies that eye contact is, a lack of eye contact is a show of respect. If they're looking down, it shows deference to you. Just understand that at least from an American standpoint, we look for eye contact and we look for body language, facial expressions to help us with nonverbal communication. Touch is one that can be, because of people's personal space, there are times that we have to think very carefully, should we touch someone? Historically, at least a handshake or at least some certain elements of common contact have been helpful in establishing communication, establishing how we work together. But touch can be seen as an invasion of my personal space or privacy. And so it's a balance. I always want to know, I'm always trying to be sure that I understand what the limits are so that I don't get to that point. And touch is probably the most challenging of the nonverbal communications. Space can certainly be one of those. Again, space is different from one societal norm to another. In some circumstances, people are a lot more likely to stand closer together when they're having a conversation. But for some people, that can make them uncomfortable. If we're used to having our space, as someone gets much closer to us when we're trying to have a conversation, sometimes it can make people feel uncomfortable. And again, that nonverbal communication, it's not just the words that you're using, but how you're saying it. The inflection in your voice, the way that you're talking about what's being done. And then, as I've mentioned before, the channel of communication, the channel may include any number of aspects, whether it's face-to-face or written communication or broadcast communication. Just understand that for teamwork, which is our topic for not tomorrow, but next week, but teamwork really centers around the role of communication. We use communication to help us share information and to share ideas and to be sure that people are bought into what's going on. In healthcare, when there's a lack of communication, medical errors can occur. As I've said before, in any given healthcare encounter, if somebody's admitted to the hospital and they stay 3 to 4 days, there's about 50 healthcare professionals that are involved in their stay. Any failure in communication along the way can be problematic for the patient. It can lead to mistakes. It can lead to medical errors. And so we've got to be able to form and work as teams. A part of that teamwork, though, is built based on communication and communication along. We've got to have good communication skills to be effective healthcare managers. If we don't have those factual, authoritative, if people don't trust us, it's going to be very difficult for you to develop any type of leadership skills. Again, any organization can make you a manager, but it takes the people that you work with who trust you and work with you for you to become a leader. We can help you develop leadership skills, but you have to have feedback from your team to really be a leader. And with that, we get to our conclusion for today. Again, back to Aristotle and rhetorica, the three elements of any conversation, and certainly a persuasive argument, is command of language, command of your audience's emotion, and who you are as a person. What type of credibility do you have? And that takes us to our 5 things for today. What is communication? What's nonverbal communication? What's the communication process? Credibility, reason, and emotion, all of that gets back to Aristotle and rhetorica, and then 3 qualities of effective communication. And from there, we get to questions. Let me stop the share here. And yes, do you have questions today?
Hi, Professor.
Hello.
Can you listen to me? Okay, my question is, what is the most important in effective communication?
So the most important effective communication is the words we use. The words that we choose, that's really the most important and the most effective way. But I say that there's so much else that goes to that. As I sit here looking at you sitting there, a part of effective communication includes eye contact. It includes facial expressions. It includes hand gestures. So all of it's really important. The most effective, the most important will always be the words that we choose, because the words that we choose reflect the intention of the message we're trying to deliver, and the facts that we're trying to share. But I say that all of it is important. The words that we choose are most important, but it's all important.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. My question is, what can be called successful communication?
So the most successful communication really depends on 2 pieces. It depends on the audience. You know, success is measured both in what I say, but also what you hear. And for it to be successful, I need to say something that you want to hear, that you are looking forward to hearing. And so if all I'm saying are things that you don't want to hear, things that you disagree with, then it's going to be difficult for me to be successful. So people are always listening to key things that impact their life. And so for it to be successful, I need to look for a way to help you enjoy, help you like whatever it is I'm trying to discuss with you or tell you. But people listen for what's in this for me. And so the sooner I can tell you what's in it for you, the easier it is for this to be successful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello.
How can we continue to communicate if we are withdraw our ideas?
Uh, the phrase, how can we communicate? And then the last part of that,
If we are reject our ideas.
just our ideas. You know, it's it depends on what the audience wants to hear. If the audience disagrees with our ideas, we have to be more logical and we have to be more persuasive. We have to show our audience that there's value in developing a new way of looking at things. Ideas can be both exciting and can be inviting. People can share in those ideas with you and really like them or really not. And when they don't, it comes back to your ability to be persuasive. How can you convince them that your idea is a good idea? And we do that with facts, we do that with clarity, we do that in a way that hopefully people trust what you're saying. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
I have a question. How should we communicate the standpoint when cultures are so different?
Let me change the volume a little bit. I had too much echo that time. So far this morning, or so far this afternoon, yeah, I've had better volume clarity. Try that. Would you repeat that again?
How should we communicate successfully when cultures are very different? Cultures
From a cultural communication standpoint,
being bigger cultural differences.
college or university?
Cultural differences.
So maybe students want to learn how to bridge the communication when people have different culture, and maybe American culture and the Chinese culture. How to bridge the communication?
So that's yes. So from different cultures, such as the Chinese culture and the American culture, that's really difficult because it's important for us. If I'm working with someone who lives in China, it's important for me to know more about the Chinese culture. And when I was there in Putian several years ago, I went to the museum. I spent time trying to learn more about Putian. But I know far less about the Chinese culture than certainly you do, or people who live there. And so one of the most important things for us to do in terms of developing trust is to learn more about each other, because we do have cultural differences. And you know, it's difficult for us to trust one another if we don't understand the cultural significance of things that we say or things that we do. You know, I can only give you an American perspective just simply because I've lived here all my life. I understand the American culture, which is a bit unusual for a lot of reasons. There's certainly a lot of Chinese influence in the American culture, particularly in the Western United States, because there are a lot of people who have come to the United States from Asia. And so whether it's Chinese culture or Japanese culture, I work with several professors who grew up in Korea. And so we see a lot of influence in America from different cultures. That's helpful, but it's not absolute. And so we always have to be sure that when we're working with someone from a different culture, that we learn as much as we can about their culture, so that we're not saying something we didn't intend to be offensive, but it could be considered offensive. You know, again, it gets back to trust. How do we trust one another? We trust one another by better understanding one another. And the more we understand each other, the easier it is for us to trust one another. And then, you know, again, from a cultural standpoint, the more we understand someone's culture, the better it is for us to be able to develop a message so that it's easier to work with. You know, the Chinese culture is historically has existed many years and is quite distinguished. But you know, sometimes from an American point of view, we just don't know as much about it as certainly we should if we're doing business with, working with, communicating with, you know, China, as you know, the largest country in the world in population, and the second largest country in the world in terms of gross domestic product. So it's very important for us to know more about China and to know more about the Chinese culture. Sometimes we don't, and sometimes that's where some of our mistakes are made in terms of communication.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. Yes.
My question is how to improve body language skills in the communication.
I'm sorry, say that again. Try not to put your hand on the mic.
How to improve body language skills in the communication.
You know, so language skills are important in communication because there are pieces within language that helps us understand things. It has to be, it is certainly English, as an example, has many different nuances to how we say things. The inflection in our voice, words that have multiple meanings. English is a confusing language at times. And so as we move from one language to another, sometimes we lose clarity just simply because there's a different way to say that. Again, the second language that I speak to some extent is Spanish, and yet sentences in Spanish aren't exactly structured the same way they are in English. And if I try to structure them the same way I would in English, it would change the meaning of the words or the meaning of the phrase. And so we do lose something in translation at times. Having people involved who understand, you know, going back to the earlier question about culture from the previous student, culture and language are incredibly important and sometimes can be very difficult in how we understand one another. Thank you. Good question.
Hi, Professor.
Hello.
Good night. Good morning. Uh, Just now, you mentioned that it's a bad idea to blame members for their poor performance in a team. However, in my opinion, I think as a leader, pointing out the shortcomings of members in a timely manner maybe can help the team to make continuous progress. I think each member should be responsible for the team. Whether placing responsibility on members is also a way to spur them to growth. How do you think about this?
And you use the best word in saying responsible. You know, it's if I use the word blame, people tend to stop hearing the rest of it because they feel like you're criticizing them. But if you use the word responsible, and that's the word you used, which I think is the best word for the situation, responsibility helps people understand what their commitment to the team is. You know, this is your responsibility, and I need you to rise to the occasion. You know, you can help a team develop their skills, develop their contribution to the organization by coaching them, by helping them understand their responsibility. And so the word responsibility is a great word to help connect with people without making them feel like I'm blaming you, it's your fault, we failed because of you. When you say things like that, it can create a disconnect and people will not want to participate. But again, going back to the word you used, and that's responsible, that's the best word because that helps members of the team understand we all have a responsibility and we all need to meet those responsibilities. And the team will succeed when people who are responsible for their part do their best in their part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This class we talk about communication. It's a very interesting question. Maybe it's a complex question. So I know another question. I want to know the communication process maybe include sender, idea, message, receiver, interpretation, feedback, and how to extend noise and channel.
So from a message standpoint, we need to think about how we're delivering the message, and in terms of being sure people understand the message. If we're using the best way to deliver the message is face-to-face communication, but sometimes it's not always possible. Sometimes it's a very simple message, such as an email or a text message. Just understand the more complicated the message becomes, the more difficult it is to use those types of communication techniques. You know, being in front of each other is the best way to communicate, is the best way to deliver a message. But sometimes it's not available. And when it's not available, we have to leverage the resources we have. And in many cases, it works just fine. We can use WeChat and share a quick message. we can use email and share a quick message. But the more it becomes complicated, the more we need to either see each other or talk to each other. And that gives us chances to ask questions and to help clarify what's being said and what's being done.
Maybe communication is very important of the healthcare managers. So fluent communication is very important.
Yes.
The fluent communication not easy. So we will start hard. Okay.
Yeah, with healthcare management, communication can make the difference in someone's in life and death at times if we're not paying attention to what needs to be done or what needs to be said. You know, healthcare management certainly requires that we are attentive to what's being said and what's being done, and good communication skills will help us and help the patient and help the patient's family get through what's a difficult situation. But communication is one of the most important things we do in healthcare management.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And all the time, thank you.
Okay, and thank you all. I will see you next week. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.